James Sullivan was working deep in the bowels of Nova Star, a massive interstellar freighter bound for the outer rim when his comm device crackled to life. The static, initially just background noise, quickly sharpened into a distinct, desperate voice. "James, I need you. I need your help." The voice was unmistakable. It was Zari, a Tharok engineer he had met during a routine maintenance stop on the Tharok orbital station, a brief encounter 3 months ago. Back then, their interaction had seemed like nothing more than an awkward conversation about machinery, but something in her voice now was different, urgent, pleading, almost primal. James froze. His fingers hovered over the control panel, wrench in hand, as his mind raced. Why would she be calling him? The Tharok, a reclusive and secretive species, seldom reached out to outsiders, especially not humans. They preferred to keep their society and technology shrouded in mystery. The fact that Zari was contacting him at all sent a chill down his spine. "Zari," he said, unsure of what to expect. "Is everything okay?" Her reply was immediate but broken with static and a strange, guttural strain. "I can't function. It's killing me, James. Your pheromones." I need her voice cut off for a moment, then returned, full of desperation. "Please, I need you. I can't. I won't survive without it." James's heart skipped a beat. The calm and composed engineer he had met seemed like a completely different person now. She was breathless, her words drenched in agony. The connection sputtered, but her final plea came through clearly. "Come to me now. I need your biology." For a moment, James was lost. He felt a wave of confusion, anxiety, and an odd twinge of something deeper, though he couldn't place it. 3 months ago, their encounter had been brief but strangely intense. He had helped repair a complex system aboard the Tharok station where she was stationed, and for some reason the air between them had felt electric. But there was no time to dwell on that. The urgency in Zari's voice cut through everything. "Hold on," he said, rushing out of the engine room, his boots clanging against the steel floor of the ship. "I'll get there as fast as I can." As he hurried to the docking bay, preparing to take a shuttle, the freighter's captain, an older woman named Riva, intercepted him. "What's going on, Sullivan?" she asked, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Emergency," James replied quickly. "I've got a distress call. I need to head to the Tharok sector." Riva frowned. "The Tharok don't usually ask for help, especially from humans. What's the story?" James hesitated. "It's complicated. A friend of mine, she's in trouble. It's biological. Something about my pheromones affecting her." Riva raised an eyebrow, a look of concern mixing with curiosity. "Be careful out there. They play by their own rules and we don't fully understand their biology. You get in over your head and we won't be able to help you." "I'll be fine," James said, although he wasn't sure if he believed it. He nodded at Riva before bolting toward the shuttle bay. The shuttle ride to the Tharok homeworld was tense. James couldn't shake the image of Zari's voice, desperate, raw, almost feral. It didn't make sense. What had started as a routine repair job had apparently spiraled into something far more serious. His mind spun with questions. Why him? What was it about his biology that Zari needed? And more importantly, how had it gotten to this point? As the shuttle approached the mist-covered planet of Tharok Prime, he couldn't help but think about the strange, almost mystical nature of the Tharok people. Their isolationist tendencies in complex society made them nearly impossible to understand. Even their planetary surface was a closely guarded secret, concealed beneath dense layers of fog that seemed to swirl endlessly, hiding the true nature of their cities and landscapes from prying eyes. Upon landing, James was immediately escorted by a group of silent Tharok soldiers, their skin glistening with a faint blue sheen that seemed to shift under the artificial lights of the landing bay. They didn't speak, but their stern expressions and the way they moved around him made it clear that he was not a guest but something closer to a prisoner. Despite his growing sense of unease, James pressed forward, driven by the memory of Zari's voice, the fear in her tone. They brought him to a sprawling research complex hidden within the Tharok jungle. It was sleek and sterile, filled with advanced technology far beyond anything James had seen before. Inside, the atmosphere felt cold, almost clinical, as if every movement and sound was being carefully monitored. He barely had time to look around before being shoved into a dimly lit room. There, lying on a metallic examination table, was Zari. She looked nothing like the confident engineer he had met. Her skin, usually smooth and shimmering with that characteristic blue hue, was now mottled and pale. Her eyes, wide and glowing faintly, locked onto him the moment he entered the room, a mixture of hope and desperation flickering in them. "James," she gasped, reaching out with trembling hands. "You came." "What happened to you?" James asked, rushing to her side. "What's going on?" Her breathing was ragged as she struggled to sit up. "It's you, your biology, my body. It's reacting to something in you. Ever since we met, I can't explain it. I need your pheromones, your presence. It's like a drug. My body can't function without it anymore." James stared at her in disbelief. This was beyond anything he could have imagined. The idea that his very biology had triggered something inside her species, something that was now slowly killing her without his presence, it was terrifying. But how he stammered. How could this happen? A new voice interrupted them, cold and detached. "Your unique biochemistry is creating a substance more addictive to Tharox than any drug we have ever encountered." James turned to see Dr. Salen, the lead Tharox scientist overseeing Zari's care. He was tall, with dark, piercing eyes and an emotionless expression that made James uneasy. "You, human, are at the center of a crisis. Your pheromones have triggered a reaction we cannot control. It is both a scientific marvel and a potential disaster for our people." James glanced back at Zari, her fragile state weighing heavily on him. "What do you want from me?" Dr. Salen's gaze was unwavering. "You will submit to our tests. We need to understand what your biology is doing to her and, by extension, what this could mean for our species. Your presence here is no longer a choice, it's a necessity." As the door to the room slid shut, James felt the gravity of the situation sink in. He wasn't just dealing with a personal crisis. This was something far larger, something that threatened to spiral into a full-blown interspecies incident. And in the back of his mind, Zari's plea still echoed. "I need you. I can't survive without you." The words haunted him, pushing aside his fear, leaving only the question of how far he was willing to go to save her. The more he thought about it, the more one thing became clear: he wasn't just here to repair machines anymore. He was caught in a web far more intricate and dangerous. As James looked down at Zari's trembling form, a sharp thought cut through the chaos in his mind. He was no longer just a mechanic in a distant galaxy. He was about to be something far more dangerous, a key in a much larger game of power, biology, and survival, caught in a scenario that could easily be described by a story more outlandish than fiction. Hot alien girl purchased as a slave tries human breeding. HFY story. And his next move could change everything. The sterile lights of the Tharok facility hummed softly as James stood motionless, his eyes locked on Zari's fragile form lying on the examination table. His mind churned with confusion and dread. How had things spiraled into such a surreal crisis? He'd been on countless missions, repaired ships in dangerous sectors, but nothing had prepared him for this: an alien woman whose life depended on him, on his very biology. Dr. Salen stood a few feet away, meticulously examining data that flashed across a holographic screen. His cold, clinical demeanor made James uneasy, as if this entire situation was just another experiment for him, a detached pursuit of knowledge. "You should know," the doctor began, his voice as sharp as the instruments scattered on the nearby tray. "What's happening to Zari is unprecedented in our history. No Tharok has ever experienced such a biological reaction to another species, let alone a human." James clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. "What do you mean unprecedented? What is happening to her?" Dr. Salen adjusted his glasses, his eyes never leaving the data. "When you and Zari met, something in your pheromones triggered an intense physiological response within her. We've identified it as a form of biochemical dependency. Over the past 3 months, her body has grown to crave your presence, your unique chemical signature. The withdrawal she is experiencing now is debilitating." James' stomach twisted at the word dependency. Zari wasn't just sick, she was addicted to him. He struggled to process the thought as he glanced at her pale, trembling figure. The once strong Tharok engineer who had confidently guided him through the orbital station now seemed fragile, like a delicate piece of glass teetering on the edge of shattering. "But how is that even possible?" James asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We only met once. How could that have led to something like this?" Dr. Salen finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Tharok biology is not like human biology. We operate on principles of symbiosis with our environment, and certain stimuli can trigger profound reactions. What we do not fully understand is why your particular pheromones had such an effect. Normally, humans and Tharok coexist without issue. But with Zari, something in her genetic makeup responded in a way that we've never seen before." James swallowed hard, the weight of the doctor's words settling uncomfortably in his chest. "And now, Dr. Salen said flatly, she cannot survive without periodic exposure to your pheromones. Her condition has deteriorated rapidly, and if we don't find a solution soon, she won't last." A heavy silence fell between them. James shifted uncomfortably, feeling the gravity of the situation press down on him. Zari's labored breathing filled the room, a haunting reminder of the urgency. He took a step toward her, gently placing a hand on the table beside her. Zari, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, a weak smile tugging at the corners of her lips. James, she breathed, her voice a whisper. It's so hard. I can't. I don't know how much longer I can fight this. Her words cut through him like a blade. He had seen death before too many times during his work in deep space, but this was different. This was personal. He hadn't known her long, but something about Zari had drawn him in from the moment they met. She wasn't just another alien, she was someone he had come to care about, even if he couldn't fully explain it. Dr. Salen interrupted the moment, his voice icy and detached. We need to begin the tests immediately. Time is running out. James bristled at the doctor's tone but knew there was no other option. What kind of tests are we talking about, he asked, his eyes narrowing. The doctor motioned to the rows of medical devices lining the walls. We need to analyze the exact nature of your pheromones and how they interact with Zari's physiology. That means extracting samples from both of you. It will be invasive but necessary. This is a matter of survival. James grimaced, instinctively clenching his fists. The idea of being subjected to Thorak technology, becoming some kind of living experiment, didn't sit well with him. But Zari's pale face reminded him that he didn't have the luxury of refusing. Her life was in the balance, and if his pheromones were the key to saving her, then he had no choice but to comply. What do I have to do, he asked, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. Dr. Salen's eyes gleamed with scientific curiosity as he activated several of the devices. You will submit to our testing protocols. We will need samples of your pheromones, blood, and cellular material. Zari's condition will be closely monitored to see how she responds to different levels of exposure. James nodded, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper with every word. He glanced at Zari once more, her fragile state a stark reminder of how little time they had. Whatever discomfort or risk the test posed, it didn't matter. He would do whatever it took to save her. Over the next several hours, James was subjected to a barrage of tests. Machines hummed and clicked as they scanned his body, drawing blood and collecting samples in a manner that made him feel more like a lab rat than a human. His body ached from the endless prodding and probing, but each time the discomfort grew unbearable, he reminded himself of the reason he was enduring at Zari. Through a glass partition, he could see her lying on the examination table in the next room, surrounded by monitoring equipment. Her vitals were weak, her skin pallid and mottled. Every few minutes, a low alarm would sound as her condition worsened. Dr. Salen and a team of Thorak scientists hovered over her, adjusting machines and administering small doses of a synthesized compound meant to mimic James' pheromones. But it wasn't enough. Each dose only seemed to delay the inevitable. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Salen approached him once more, his expression grim. Her body is rejecting the synthetic compound. We knew this was a possibility, but it's worse than we anticipated. Without direct exposure to your pheromones, her system will collapse within the next 24 hours. James wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles tense with exhaustion. So what's the plan? You said these tests would help. The doctor hesitated, which only deepened James' sense of dread. The tests have provided some insight, but we are running out of time. It's clear that Zari's dependency is too severe to be treated with synthesized compounds. The only viable solution is prolonged, direct exposure. What does that mean? James demanded, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Dr. Salen's voice was calm, almost dispassionate. It means that in order to stabilize her condition, you will need to remain in close proximity to her for an extended period, perhaps indefinitely. Your pheromones must be constantly present to regulate her system. James blinked, momentarily stunned by the enormity of the suggestion. Indefinitely. Was he supposed to just stay here in this facility with Zari forever? He looked past the doctor, his eyes settling on Zari's fragile form once more. She had become a prisoner of her own body, her life slipping away, and all because of something neither of them could have predicted. He thought back to the day they met, how she had looked at him with curiosity, how their brief touch had felt like an electric shock. He never imagined it would come to this, a biological crisis with no simple answer. Dr. Salen interrupted his thoughts. We are prepared to offer you a solution. You will be housed here at the facility, provided with everything you need. As long as Zari remains in need of your pheromones, your continued presence is essential. James took a deep breath, trying to process the magnitude of what he was being asked. His entire life, his career, his future, everything would be put on hold indefinitely. But then he glanced back at Zari, her labored breathing growing weaker by the moment. Could he really walk away? Could he live with himself if he let her die? He looked at Dr. Salen, his voice quiet but firm. I'll do it. The doctor nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then we'll begin preparations immediately. Time is of the essence. As the machines powered down and the tests were concluded, James felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. The biological crisis wasn't just about Zari anymore. It was about them, about the strange, impossible bond they shared, and the future that now hung in the balance. As he watched Zari from across the room, James couldn't shake the feeling that their connection was only the beginning of something far larger, far more dangerous than either of them had realized. And there was no turning back now. James sat in the dimly lit corner of his small quarters, staring at the cold metal walls around him. It had been days since the tests had begun, and the weight of his decision hung heavy in the air. He was no longer free. He was bound to this facility, to Zari, and to the complex biological entanglement that had turned his life upside down. Every day the Tharok scientists came and went, administering treatments, taking measurements, and studying the strange bond between him and Zari as if they were pieces of machinery components in some grand experiment. But for James, it was more than that. It wasn't just about biology, pheromones, or survival anymore. Something deeper was happening, something that none of the cold, calculating minds in the lab could fully grasp. He found himself thinking about Zari more than he cared to admit. Not just her condition, which was growing worse despite their efforts, but the way her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, the way her soft voice resonated with an otherworldly beauty. He remembered how she had smiled even through the pain when he first arrived, how despite everything there was something undeniably human in her suffering, something that connected them on a level far beyond the science being conducted here. It was irrational, illogical. But every time he stepped into that sterile lab, every time their eyes met, he felt the pull growing stronger. He was drawn to her. There was a knock at the door, interrupting his thoughts. The sound echoed hollowly in the metallic room. James stood up, already knowing who it would be. When he opened the door, Dr. Salen stood there, his usual clinical expression masked by a hint of impatience. "It's time," the doctor said. "Zari's condition is unstable. We need to administer another session of direct exposure." James nodded, though a tightness formed in his chest. He had gotten used to these sessions where he would be brought into Zari's room, monitored by an array of Tharok scientists. He had to stay close to her for hours, sometimes touching her, sometimes simply being there, while the machines recorded how her body responded to his presence. It was intimate in the most uncomfortable way, but it was also the only thing keeping her alive. As he followed Dr. Salen through the long, sterile corridors, James couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. The Tharok facility, for all its advanced technology and secrecy, had the atmosphere of a prison, and he was its latest captive. But at the center of it all was Zari, a woman who had been reduced to a fragile experiment, an enigma they were all trying to solve. When they reached her room, the door slid open with a soft hiss. The familiar sight of glowing monitors and sleek medical equipment filled his vision, but all of it faded into the background as his gaze landed on Zari. She lay on the examination table, her blue-tinged skin glistening under the low lights. Her breathing was shallow, her form barely moving, but the moment James entered the room, her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. "James," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. He crossed the room and sat beside her, the machines around them humming softly. "I'm here," he said quietly, reaching out to take her hand. Her fingers were cool to the touch, trembling slightly, but as soon as their skin made contact, a faint warmth spread through her. Her breathing steadied, and the flicker of life returned to her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her violet eyes searching his. "Every time you come, it helps. It's the only thing that helps." James forced a small smile, though the words twisted inside him. He was the reason she was still alive, but he was also the reason she was in this situation in the first place. "I wish there was more I could do," he said, his voice tight. She shook her head weakly. "You're doing enough. More than enough." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the soft beeping of the machines. The scientists on the other side of the observation glass were watching, as always, documenting every moment, but James barely noticed them anymore. All he could focus on was Zari, her pale blue skin, the way her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, the way her fingers tightened around his hand as if he were her lifeline. "I never thought this would happen," Zari said after a while, her voice soft and distant. "I never imagined that something as simple as meeting you would change everything." James swallowed, feeling the strange tension between them thickening. "Neither did I." She smiled weakly, though there was sadness behind it. "It's strange, isn't it? Our species. We were never supposed to connect like this. Never meant to be so close." James felt the weight of her words, the unspoken truth that hung between them. The Tharok and humans had always maintained a certain distance, diplomatic but never truly connected. Their biology, their cultures, their very existence seemed to operate on different wavelengths. And yet here they were, tied together in the most intimate and inexplicable way. "I don't think this is something anyone could have predicted," James replied, his voice quiet. "But here we are." Zari's eyes softened as she looked at him, something deeper flickering in her gaze. "James, I know this isn't easy for you. Being trapped here, being part of this. I know what they're asking of you is a lot. But I want you to know that I'm grateful. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just gratitude in her voice, it was something else, something deeper that he couldn't quite name. His heart began to race, and for a moment he struggled to breathe. Being near her had become more than just a duty, more than just about keeping her alive. It had become personal, and in that instant he realized what was happening. He was falling for her. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just her vulnerability or her beauty, though both were undeniable. It was the connection they had forged through shared survival, through the inexplicable bond that tied their lives together. He had spent so many nights thinking about her, worrying about her, and now, as he looked into her eyes, he knew that this was something far beyond biology. It was attraction raw, undeniable, and utterly forbidden. He tried to push the thought away, to remind himself of the cold, scientific reality of their situation. She was dependent on his pheromones, and that was why she felt this way. It was just a biological reaction, nothing more. But even as he tried to rationalize it, the truth gnawed at him. Every time he touched her, every time he saw the way her eyes softened when he entered the room, he knew that it wasn't just the pheromones. There was something real between them, something that went beyond the sterile walls of this facility. James Zari's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and trembling. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the observation glass, where the scientists were still watching. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't think it's just the pheromones anymore. I feel something different, something more." James's breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what she was talking about, but hearing her say it made it all the more real. The tension between them was almost unbearable now, the air thick with unspoken emotions. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what's happening between us, but it's real. I can't explain it, but it feels real." Her hand tightened around his, and for a moment they just sat there in silence, the weight of their confession settling between them. The machines beeped softly in the background, the glow of the monitors casting faint shadows across the room, but all of it faded into the background. All that mattered was this moment, this connection. Zari's eyes glistened as she looked at him, her voice trembling. "James, if things were different. If we weren't trapped here, if I wasn't—" "Don't," James interrupted gently, squeezing her hand. "Don't think about that. We'll figure this out, okay? We'll find a way." Zari smiled weakly, though the sadness never left her eyes. "I hope you're right. But whatever happens, I'm glad it was you. I'm glad we found each other." James's heart ached at her words. He wanted to say more, to tell her how he felt, to let her know that this wasn't just about survival anymore. But the door slid open, and Dr. Salen's cold voice cut through the moment. "Time's up," the doctor announced, stepping into the room. "We need to begin the next phase of testing." James reluctantly pulled his hand away from Zari's, the warmth of her touch lingering on his skin. He stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just been said and what hadn't been said. As he left the room, the door hissing shut behind him, James knew that this was only the beginning. The attraction between them was no longer something he could ignore, and it was only going to get harder from here. He was falling for her, and no matter how forbidden it was, no matter how dangerous, he couldn't stop it. But in the back of his mind, one thought lingered: how long could they keep this up before everything came crashing down around them? James paced the sterile room, his mind racing. The tight quarters of the facility had begun to close in on him, the constant presence of the Tharok scientists suffocating. The weight of Zari's condition hung heavily on his shoulders, but now, something far more sinister was at play. The whispers of discontent within the Tharok government had reached his ears. Dr. Salen, usually cold and detached, had become unusually tense, avoiding direct eye contact as he worked. Something was wrong, and James could feel it in his gut. Then came the breaking point. Zari's room had been suddenly sealed off. A team of heavily armored guards stationed outside her door. The few exchanges James had overheard between the scientists painted a grim picture of the Tharok leadership, fearing the potential consequences of their discovery. Were considering eliminating the human problem altogether. They couldn't allow the situation to escalate into an interspecies incident. If James was removed from the equation, Zari's death would be explained away as an unfortunate medical failure. A tragic but isolated event. Their secret would be safe. He had no time to waste. If they acted, both he and Zari would be dead. James hurried through the facility, every step echoing with urgency. He needed to get to Zari before it was too late. His thoughts raced, heart pounding with the realization that this might be their only chance to escape. The Tharok facility was built like a fortress, but there had to be a way out, a weak point, something they could exploit. As he approached Zari's room, he saw the guards standing like statues, their alien forms covered in sleek, dark armor. He ducked behind a corner, adrenaline surging through his veins as he considered his options. There were two of them, and he was unarmed. Fighting his way through wasn't an option, but his training as a mechanic gave him another idea. If he could access the facility's security system, maybe he could trigger an emergency something to draw the guards away from Zari's room. James glanced down the hall, spotting a small access panel near the floor. Without wasting a moment, he pried it open and began working, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Years of fixing Starship systems had honed his skills, and now they were the only thing standing between him and certain death. Sweat dripped from his brow as he hacked into the security grid, bypassing several layers of complex Tharok encryption. Finally, with a sharp beep, the facility's alarm blared to life. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor in a pulsating glow as warning sirens echoed through the halls. The guards reacted immediately, glancing at each other before speaking into their communicators. As expected, they abandoned their post, rushing off toward the source of the disturbance. James wasted no time. He sprinted toward Zari's room, his heart hammering in his chest. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Zari lying on the medical bed, still weak and connected to various monitoring devices. Her pale skin shimmered faintly in the emergency lighting, her breathing shallow but steady. She stirred as he approached, her violet eyes fluttering open. "James," she whispered, her voice strained but filled with relief. "What's happening?" "We don't have much time," James said quickly, disconnecting her from the machines. "They're planning something. I think they're going to kill us both. We need to get out of here now." Zari's eyes widened, the gravity of the situation settling in. She struggled to sit up, her body still weakened from the withdrawal, but James was there, steadying her with a gentle hand. "I'm not leaving without you," he said, his voice firm. "We'll get through this together." With great effort, Zari managed to stand, leaning heavily on James for support. "There's a back entrance," she murmured, her voice shaky. "It leads into the endless mist forest. We'll be safe there. For a while." James nodded, helping her move as quickly as she could. They slipped out of the room and into the dimly lit corridors, the wail of the alarm still blaring. The facility had descended into chaos, with scientists and guards rushing in all directions, distracted by the emergency James had triggered. It was the perfect cover for their escape. As they approached the rear of the complex, James couldn't shake the growing sense of danger. The Tharok were not going to let them go easily. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. Zari's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and every few steps she stumbled, her body growing weaker. But James refused to give up. He held her close, his arm wrapped around her waist, offering her as much strength as he could. Finally, they reached the rear entrance, a large, heavily reinforced door that led to the wilderness beyond. James activated the control panel, his heart pounding as the door groaned open, revealing the thick, swirling mists of the forest beyond. The air was cool and damp, the eerie silence of the forest a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. "We're almost there," James said, his voice tense with determination. "Just a little further." They stepped into the mist, the dense fog wrapping around them like a shroud. The ground beneath their feet was soft and uneven, the landscape alien and disorienting. Strange shapes loomed in the distance, massive, twisted trees with glowing bioluminescent leaves. The forest seemed alive, whispering with unseen movement. Every shadow, every shifting mist made James's pulse quicken, but he pressed on, guiding Zari through the unfamiliar terrain. Suddenly, a sound cut through the quiet, a distant shout, followed by the unmistakable hum of Tharok hovercraft. They were being pursued. James tightened his grip on Zari's hand, urgency surging through him. "We need to move faster." But Zari's strength was fading. She stumbled again, nearly collapsing, her breath ragged and shallow. I can't keep up," she gasped, her voice barely audible. James stopped, looking around desperately. They were too exposed out here. They needed to find shelter, something that would buy them time to recover and plan their next move. His eyes scanned the mist-covered landscape, searching for anything that might offer refuge. "There's," Zari whispered, pointing toward a cluster of massive, twisted trees. "There's a cave system beneath those roots. We can hide there." Without another word, James hoisted her up, half carrying her as they made their way toward the trees. The sounds of the approaching Thurok forces grew louder, but James pushed forward, adrenaline driving him as they reached the tree line. The thick roots twisted like tendrils, and beneath them, he saw the entrance to the caves dark and narrow, but enough to keep them hidden. They ducked inside, the cool, damp air of the cave offering a brief respite. Zari collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. James knelt beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. They had made it for now. But the danger was far from over. As he looked down at her, his hand brushing a strand of her hair from her face, he realized just how close they had come to losing everything. Zari's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with a faint smile, despite her exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for not giving up on me." James's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. "I'll never give up on you," he said softly, his voice filled with determination. "We're in this together, no matter what." And as they sat there in the dim light of the cave, the sounds of their pursuers growing ever closer, James knew that their fight was just beginning. The cave was damp, the walls slick with moisture, and the air thick with an almost oppressive silence. James sat beside Zari, the faint glow of the bioluminescent fungus from the forest casting eerie shadows on the cave's walls. He could hear her labored breathing, the sound haunting in the quiet of the underground chamber. They had escaped, but only barely, and now the weight of their situation bore down on him like a leaden sky. Zari was fading fast. Her body had grown weaker with each passing hour, her skin pale and clammy, and even though James had done everything he could to keep her safe, he knew they were running out of time. The Thurok forces were likely combing the forest above, and they couldn't stay hidden here for long. They needed a plan, a solution, but more than anything, they needed a miracle. Zari stirred beside him, her voice a faint whisper. "James, there's something I didn't tell you." He turned to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" She took a shaky breath, her violet eyes meeting his with a flicker of determination. "This cave. These roots. They're part of something much older. There's a network of ruins beneath the forest. Ancient Thurok ruins from a time before our people retreated into isolation." James frowned, processing her words. "Ruins? What kind of ruins?" Zari shifted, wincing as she tried to sit up. "They were once temples, places of immense power. The Thurok of old used them to study the connections between our people and the natural world. But more importantly, they experimented with symbiotic relationships between species. There might be something down there, something that could help us." His eyes widened as the weight of her revelation hit him. "You think we'll find something in these ruins that can help you recover? Maybe reverse the effects of this dependency?" Zari nodded weakly. "It's possible. The ruins hold knowledge long forgotten by most Thurok. But I remember the stories, the legends passed down in secret. There's a chance, a small one, but it's all we have." James felt a surge of hope, fragile but enough to keep him moving. They couldn't just sit here and wait for death to find them. If there was even a slim chance the ruins could offer a solution, they had to take it. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice full of urgency. Zari nodded, though her movements were slow and painful. James helped her to her feet, steadying her as she leaned against him. Together they moved deeper into the cave, the darkness ahead swallowing them as they ventured further underground. The narrow tunnel opened into a wider cavern, the air growing cooler as they descended. The glow from the bioluminescent fungi dimmed, replaced by a strange, soft light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was as if the cave was alive, the stone infused with the remnants of some ancient power. The deeper they went, the more the cave felt like something out of a dream or perhaps a nightmare. Suddenly, the tunnel took a sharp turn, and they found themselves standing before a massive stone door, half buried beneath the gnarled roots of the trees above. Intricate carvings adorned the surface of the door, symbols and patterns that James didn't recognize but that seemed to pulse faintly, as if in response to their presence. Zari gasped softly, her eyes wide with recognition. "This is it," she whispered. "We've found the entrance." James stepped forward, running his hand over the ancient stone. The symbols glowed faintly under his touch, and a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the stone and into his bones. It felt as though the ruins were awakening, responding to their arrival. He glanced at Zari, who looked equally mesmerized by the ancient door. "How do we open it?" he asked. Zari hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath, steadying herself. These temples were designed to respond to certain frequencies, specific biological signatures that resonate with the natural energies of the Thurok people. I think it might need a combination of Thurok and human energy to unlock." James frowned. "You mean it requires both of us?" She nodded. Our bond is connected to the very thing these ruins were built to explore. A symbiosis between two species. I believe that's why your presence here is important. The ruins won't respond without you. James felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. The idea that their connection, something he had initially believed to be a deadly mistake, might actually be the key to unlocking ancient Thurok secrets was almost too much to process. But there was no turning back now. They had come this far, and he was willing to risk anything if it meant saving Zari's life. Let's do this, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. They stood before the door, their hands outstretched, fingertips brushing the glowing symbols. As their hands touched the stone together, a sudden surge of energy coursed through them, and the carvings lit up in a brilliant display of light. The humming grew louder, reverberating through the cavern as the door began to move, grinding open with a deep, resonant sound. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber, its walls lined with glowing crystals that pulsed with an ancient power. In the center of the room stood a towering obelisk, its surface covered in more intricate carvings, the symbols glowing brighter as they approached. The air in the chamber was thick with energy, a palpable force that seemed to resonate with every step they took. Zari's eyes widened as they entered the chamber, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This is it, she whispered. The heart of the temple. James could feel it too, a deep, powerful presence in the room, something ancient and alive. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a repository of knowledge, an archive of forgotten power. And in the center of it all was the obelisk, humming with energy that seemed to call out to them. Zari stumbled forward, her hand reaching for the obelisk. This might be the key to understanding everything, she said, her voice trembling. If we can unlock its secrets, we might be able to fix what's happening to me. James watched as she placed her hand on the obelisk, her fingers trembling as the ancient symbols flared to life. The light from the crystals grew brighter, casting the chamber in a blinding glow. The air crackled with energy, and James could feel a strange force pulling at him, drawing him closer to the obelisk. Suddenly, the symbols on the obelisk shifted, rearranging themselves into a new pattern. A low hum filled the air, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The chamber seemed to come alive, as if the very stones were waking from a long slumber. Zari gasped, her eyes widening as the energy surged through her. I can feel it, she whispered. It's changing me. James stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you mean? Zari looked at him, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The energy. It's stabilizing my system. The bond between us, it's not just a biological accident. It's part of something much older, something the Thurok once understood but have long since forgotten. James felt a shiver run down his spine. And what does that mean for us? Zari smiled faintly, the glow in her eyes softening. It means we're more connected than we ever realized. And if we can harness this power, we might be able to save both our species. The ground trembled once more, the light from the obelisk growing brighter. James felt the energy surging through him, his connection to Zari deepening with every passing second. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything he had imagined. And as they stood together in the heart of the ancient ruins, James knew that their journey was far from over. The secrets they had uncovered here were just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, a challenge that would test the strength of their bond and the future of both their worlds. But for the first time since this ordeal had begun, James felt a spark of hope. They had found the hidden ruins. And with it, the possibility of salvation. The ruins trembled around them, the ancient walls vibrating with a low, ominous hum. James stood beside Zari, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the glowing symbols on the obelisk pulse with energy. The air crackled, thick with the raw power they had just unleashed. Whatever force they had tapped into was vast, ancient, and unpredictable. But they weren't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber, drawing James's attention to the entrance. There, silhouetted against the flickering light of the crystals, stood General Cole, the imposing Thurok military leader. His face was etched with determination and anger, his dark eyes focused on James and Zari with a burning intensity. Behind him, a squad of Thurok soldiers filed in, their weapons raised and ready. You should not have come here, Cole growled, his voice cold and filled with authority. This place, this power, is not for you to control. James stepped in front of Zari instinctively, his heart racing. We don't want to fight you, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. We came here to find a solution. Zari's life depends on it. Cole's eyes flickered with contempt. Your presence has corrupted her. You, human, are a threat to the balance of our people. Your pheromones have poisoned her system, turned her into something unnatural. He glanced at Zari, disgust and pity mixing in his gaze. And now you seek to use the ancient powers of our ancestors for your own gain? I will not allow it. James clenched his fists, a surge of anger bubbling up inside him. This isn't about gain, he snapped. It's about survival for both of us. Cole's lip curled. Survival? You have no idea what you're playing with. These ruins were never meant to be disturbed by outsiders. The knowledge here is sacred, and your meddling could doom us all. Zari, still leaning on the obelisk for support, stepped forward, her voice weak but resolute. General Cole, please. This power, it's not meant for destruction. It's a tool for connection, for healing. We can use it to save lives, not end them. Cole's expression hardened. You've already betrayed your people by aligning with this human, he spat. You've forsaken your heritage. The only way to protect our future is to end this now. He raised his hand, signaling the soldiers to move forward. James's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. There were too many of them, and they were heavily armed. He couldn't fight them, not like this. But there had to be another way. His eyes flicked to the obelisk behind Zari, still glowing with energy. The ancient symbols, pulsing with power, seemed to call out to him, as if offering a solution just beyond his understanding. And then it hit him. The bond between him and Zari, the connection that had brought them here, was the key. The obelisk had responded to their combined presence, to the unique symbiosis between human and Tharok biology. Perhaps if they could tap into that power again, they could stop Cole without violence. Zari, James said quietly, turning to her. We need to try something. She looked at him, her violet eyes filled with both fear and trust. What do you mean? The obelisk, he explained, glancing back at the towering stone structure. It responded to us before, when we touched it together. Maybe we can use it to stop them. I don't know how, but we have to try. Zari hesitated for a moment, her body trembling from the strain of her illness. But then she nodded, a determined look crossing her face. Let's do it. As the soldiers closed in, weapons raised, James and Zari stepped forward, their hands reaching for the obelisk. The moment their fingers touched the cold stone surface, a surge of energy shot through them, so powerful it nearly knocked them off their feet. The ancient symbols flared to life, brighter than before, bathing the chamber in a brilliant, pulsating light. Cole's soldiers stopped in their tracks, confusion and fear flickering across their faces. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls of the chamber seemed to ripple with the force of the energy being released. General Cole's face twisted with fury. Stop them, he shouted, his voice rising above the growing hum of the obelisk. But it was too late. The energy from the obelisk surged through James and Zari, their bond amplifying the power that coursed through the ancient structure. The air crackled with electricity, and a wave of force exploded outward, sending the soldiers staggering back. The weapons in their hands flickered and died, shorting out as the energy disrupted their systems. Cole stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief as the power of the obelisk washed over him. He took a step back, raising his hand to shield his face from the blinding light, but he was powerless against the force that now filled the chamber. James could feel the connection deepening, not just between him and Zari, but with the entire room, the ancient energy resonating through every stone and crystal. It wasn't just raw power, it was something more profound. It was the energy of life, of connection, of unity. And in that moment, he understood. This is what the ancient Tharok were trying to achieve, Zari whispered, her voice filled with awe. A bond between species, a symbiosis that could heal and unite, not destroy. James nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the power surged through him. We can use it, to stop the fighting, to bring peace. With one final push, they channeled the energy outward, directing it toward Cole and his soldiers. The wave of power enveloped them, not with violence, but with a gentle, overwhelming force. Cole dropped to his knees, his face contorted in shock as the energy flowed through him, stripping away his anger and hatred, leaving only understanding in its wake. The chamber fell silent. Cole's soldiers stood frozen, their weapons lowered, their expressions dazed and uncertain. The general himself remained on the ground, breathing heavily as he tried to process what had just happened. James and Zari collapsed against the obelisk, their bodies weak from the strain of channeling such immense power. But they had done it. They had stopped the violence without shedding blood. Zari looked at James, her eyes filled with both exhaustion and relief. We did it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. James smiled weakly, his chest heaving with the effort to catch his breath. Yeah, he said softly. We did. Cole slowly rose to his feet, his expression no longer one of anger but of quiet contemplation. He looked at Zari, Then at James, his eyes searching for something, perhaps an understanding of what had just transpired, or perhaps something deeper. You used the power of the ancients, Cole said, his voice hoarse. But not to destroy. To heal. James nodded. That's what this place was always meant for. Connection. Unity. Cole lowered his head, shame flickering across his face. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought this power would only bring ruin. But I see now that I was blinded by fear. Zari stepped forward, her body still weak but her voice strong. It's not too late, General. We can still use this power for good for both our peoples. Cole looked at her, then at James, and slowly nodded. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this is the beginning of something new. As the tension in the room eased, James felt a sense of profound relief wash over him. The battle was over, but the journey ahead was just beginning. Together, he and Zari had tapped into something ancient, something powerful, but more importantly, they had shown that peace was possible. The Tharok soldiers slowly began to lower their weapons, the hostility fading from their eyes as they recognized the truth in what had just occurred. The ruins, once a place of forgotten power, had become a beacon of hope. As James and Zari stood together, their hands still resting on the obelisk, they knew that their bond had been forged in something far greater than biology. It had been shaped by their determination to survive, their refusal to give in to fear, and their belief that together they could change the future. And in that moment, as the ruins hummed softly around them, they knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and uncertainty, but they would face it together. A new era was dawning for both humans and Tharok, and they would be at the heart of it. A new beginning. A new hope. Together.